I'm Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of RedMonk. RedMonk, for those of you who have not heard of us, is a developer-focused industry analyst firm, which of course begs the question, what is a developer-focused industry analyst firm in the first place? The answer is exactly what it sounds like, honestly. We're an industry analyst firm in the sense that we read, research, and write on technology and technical trends, directions, tools, platforms, programming languages, really anything that developers use to build applications today are things that we're interested in and read and write on. And the developer portion of that statement is sort of core and critical to what we do at RedMonk. Our thesis, as long as we've been around, is that developers are what we refer to as the new Kingmakers. So for a variety of reasons, which would take too long to go into today, there's a whole book on this called The New Kingmakers, if anybody's interested. We are, and have been sort of as long as we've been around, convinced that developers are among the most important constituencies, if not the most important constituency in technology today. And we believe that for a couple of reasons, in part because they are determining, in many cases, what technologies get used and what technologies don't. Because through open source and through, again, a variety of sort of different shifts in the market over the past decade plus, developers are in a position to choose in ways that they were not able to before. So part of this, of course, is through open source software. The reason that we're presumably all here today. Developers, in many cases, just have a wealth of software at their fingertips, which basically gives them the green light. It gives them the green light to go out and build, to go out and essentially experiment in ways that they couldn't before, because for the first time, developers didn't need permission. So before becoming an analyst in the 90s, I was a systems integrator. I was out running around, implementing, building different things for clients. And in an experience probably similar to the one that many of you in the room have, if I wanted to build literally anything, a pilot project for ourselves, sort of a toy test for a client, whatever it might be, I had to go and ask for permission, right? I had to secure licenses to everything that I might need. That might be an operating system, that might be a database, it might be a server, it might be front-end tools. Everything I needed to construct an application, I had to go and find budget for or find existing licenses for. Through open source software, of course, this has changed. Virtually anything I could possibly want today, I can obtain for free. And that's free as in beer. I don't want to get into the whole free software, sort of free debate here, because it's not particularly, well, let's just say it's not a fun debate in the best of times. And certainly we don't have time for it here. But the net is that from a developer standpoint, I don't need to ask for permission. I can go out and I can experiment and I can do whatever it is that I want to do using high quality software. And software in many cases, which is the same software that runs some of the largest and highest scale organizations today. So that's all great, but at the end of the day, that software needs somewhere to run, right? I need something to run on. I need a platform. And for years, this was, essentially something that developers in a lot of organizations stumbled with, right? Hey, this is great. I can go out and get an operating system for free. I can go out and get a database for free, an application server for free, an IDE for free. That's all wonderful, and that is transformative. But at the end of the day, I have to essentially find some place to run this, some place to host my application, something to run it on. So in 2006, as is well known at this point, a small retailer based out of Seattle, a company that in the technology industry at least nobody was paying any attention to, dropped two services in March and August of that year. The first was Simple Storage Service, S3. The second was Elastic Compute Cloud, EC2. These formed together essentially the basis for what we today know as Amazon Web Services. So this is interesting for several reasons, but among them is the fact that developers who already had access to this huge wealth of open source software now for the first time had essentially an erector set, which they could build anything they wanted. And they could build, importantly, at the rate and pace that they wanted, using financial terms that were essentially available to them. So, everybody in this room, I'm sure, understands, sort of the CapEx, OpEx shift. So I won't go into detail on that here, except to say that, basically, if you look at the numbers, and this quote, importantly, is from 2011, if I remember right. So Flip Kromer was a startup, the founder of a startup based out of Austin. It was a data startup. And these economics are transformative for a number of reasons. But importantly, when we think about it from the importance on an individual level, this is enormously transformative. So, on the one hand, hey, this is great. I don't need to essentially come up with the capital up front to purchase, a 10 machine cluster for a terabyte. Instead, I can do that, if I have a $10 bill. And most developers, particularly given the salaries these days, are going to have a $10 bill. But just as importantly, I don't need to purchase that and then maintain it and host it over time. I can essentially spin this up when I need it and kill it when I don't. So the economics, even on an individual level, everybody in the room I'm sure understands this from an organizational standpoint. But this coupled with open source software put developers in a driver's seat in the sense that they have access to this huge library of open source software, and now for the first time, they have the ability to take these existing services and put them together in ways that we've never seen before. And the consequences of this shift from an economic perspective, again, are pretty well understood, right? We all understand, I think, the profound changes that the industry is undergoing, driven in part by the cloud. And the cloud, of course, is driven itself in part by the underlying economics of open source software. But the net is that, really, what do we find? What do we find when, we put all these things together, we put the cloud together, we put open source software together? We find a world that looks a lot like this. And this is a world that is profoundly different from the one that certainly I grew up with. And certainly many of the clients that I work with when I was a systems integrator, and certainly the clients that we worked with early in the formation of RedMonk, this is not at all what the world looked like. So basically what we see is that whether it's software, whether it's hardware, whether it's some combination of both, what ends up getting used in most cases is going to be what the developers in your organization want to use. One way or another, they're going to find it. And this, again, this is a trend that stretches back well over a decade, right? I used to tell audiences all the time, if you take something like Linux, which we all take for granted now, as having been successful and having been the backbone of enterprises all over the world, it didn't get there because of analysts like myself. It didn't get there because of CIOs. It got there because developers used it, it was available, it was free, it did what they wanted to do, and all of a sudden, over time, developers woke up and said, hey, this is great, I'm going to keep using this, I'm going to keep building what I want to build on the backs of this open source operating system. And all of a sudden, CIOs took a look around their data centers and said, I don't know what the hell happened, but I know I'm running a lot of this. And that's the commercial opportunity that created, among other things, Red Hat. And this trend has just continued on and on and on. We all, I'm sure, can think of, example after example after example. Cloud, which we've talked about, certainly is one of them, in which the tools that developers want to pick up and use are the ones that ultimately get rolled out to production sort of over time. I can't tell you how many times I've been in vendor presentations, and a show of hands says, hey, how many people are using the cloud? How many people are using things like Amazon Web Services or Azure or Google? And the answer comes back, no, we're not using any of that. And then you go out and talk to the actual developers working for those organizations, and they'll quietly pull you aside and say, yeah, no, the whole thing runs on that. They're not aware of that. So the net is that, the world that we see, more often than not, and of course there's exceptions, looks very much like this. So, okay, cloud is important, open source is important. What does that mean to me from an organizational standpoint? What do I do with that? How am I supposed to process that? What are the important takeaways? So obviously there are any number of different things that we could talk about, and particularly for somebody who does what I do in my line of work, I could talk about this literally for weeks. We don't have weeks. We only have probably another 15 or 20 minutes. So what I wanted to do was talk about 5 things. 5 important takeaways, 5 important shifts that, in my view, all of you in the room who are consuming, leveraging open source software, incorporating it as part of your organization, will have the opportunity to think about in terms of what it means for you personally. So the first is what we refer to internally as a software paradox. So quick show of hands, how many of you in the room have read the Mark Andreessen op-ed, Software is Eating the World? All right, so that's probably about half of you. For those of you who haven't, it's basically summed up pretty easily. It's summed up in the idea that organizations, all of them, for the most part, would rather be Netflix than Blockbuster. All right, that's ultimately what it comes down to. And the way that you become Netflix rather than Blockbuster, at least in part, of course it's more than this, and there's a lot more strategy that goes into it, which is one reason why digital transformation to me is a tremendously short-sighted term. That being said, when we think about it, the way that you do that is via software. The way that you do that is by essentially building digital businesses, digital experiences for customers, and on and on and on. There's so many buzzwords, sort of surrounding these presentations, and I'm sure all of you have heard them far more often than I have. So I won't go into detail here, except to say that, I don't see as an analyst, I don't see how you would build the argument these days that software is not more important than it has ever been before. Software is the driving force in organizations across the world. Now, here's the paradox part. The interesting thing is that while software's importance from a strategic standpoint has been going up, its realizable commercial value for most providers has been going down. So example. So on the one hand, this is Oracle's software revenues, and this is only through 2013. This is the figures I had available at the time. The trend since is effectively the same. And what you see here is that this is the portrait, on the one hand, of a very healthy software business. With the exception of a period in the wake of the dot-com implosion, Oracle has been able to very consistently grow its software revenue over time. So, you probably sit there and think, well, I don't understand where you're going with this. I thought there was a paradox here. I thought it was more difficult for organizations to sell software today than it has been in the past. Well, Oracle does something very interesting in its financial releases. Something very interesting and relatively unique. They, for reasons that I'm unaware of, but certainly from the perspective of an analyst, I'm very grateful for it, they break out, as part of their filings, the portion of licenses the portion of revenue, rather, that comes from the sale of a new license versus support, service, or other attendant software revenues. So the question is, while Oracle's software revenue is going up, what's happened to their ability to sell new licenses to their software? That doesn't look as good. What you find here is that if you parse this chart, around the year 2000, right around 71 cents of every dollar that Oracle took in came from the sale of a new license to one of its products. As of 2013, that number was below 38 cents. And this is one of the reasons that when I agreed to speak here today, one of the things that I wanted to talk about essentially was the intersection of cloud and open source. Because one of the interesting things that Oracle has done since 2013 essentially is amend their filing structures. So now, in addition to reporting new sales of new licenses to their software, they're essentially conflating it with their cloud business. And that's a trend that we're going to see quite a bit more of over time. So number two, convenience kills. So the funny thing is that on a personal level, literally everybody in this room understands this. Right? We all understand the importance of convenience from a business standpoint. The example that I usually trot out in this case is the original formation of 7-Eleven. So anybody who's been to a 7-Eleven understands it's one of the prototypical convenience stores. How did that come about? Well, it turns out they started as a Southland Ice Company. So they sold essentially blocks of ice. This is pre-refrigeration. And one of their store owners decided, hey, while people are here getting their ice, why don't we keep some other things cool that maybe they want? Eggs, milk, bread. Okay, great. And while they're here, there's this new thing, sort of sweeping the country called the automobile. What if while they were here, they could also fill up and get some gas? And by the way, what if we stayed open 7 days? What if we stayed open 24 hours a day? And on and on and on. And this was essentially the birth of the modern convenience store. And this is something, particularly in this city with bodegas, everybody understands. Right? This is not a difficult concept to impart. The interesting thing is that from a technology standpoint, and I don't know if this is true of any of you in the room, we spend most of our time, talking to vendors about what they're building, why they're building it, and how they're building it, more particularly from a developer standpoint. The interesting thing is that if you go out and talk to vendors, and you talk to them about hey, how many meetings have you had about convenience? How many meetings have you had about thinking through the implications of your product and how convenient it is for developers to access and use? The answer in most cases is, I've had 0 meetings on that topic. It's something we all understand, we all agree, generally, that convenience is important, and yet somehow it just gets lost. It does not translate from a product standpoint. And here is something that is really important, for open source communities in particular to understand in terms of how it plays out. One of the arguments, particularly if you talk to the press, historically, about open source, if you talk to reporters, particularly reporters who are new to the technology beat, did not understand open source particularly well, one of the things that they always assumed, it was a fundamental planning assumption of every article they wrote, was that the primary and in many cases sole driver for the use of open source software was price, was the fact that it was free. That's the only reason people would use these databases, the only people that would use the operating systems, and on and on and on. And one of the things that became pretty clear, certainly over time, is that really one of the driving factors, sure, price was huge, as we talked about. Hey, I don't need to go talk to somebody to get access to a particular piece of software. But at the same time, it's the convenience factor, right? It's the fact that, okay, if I'm assembling an application, I need a database. And I can choose to talk to an Oracle account rep, or I can go download Postgres. For most developers, that's not a difficult thing. That's not a difficult conversation to have, right? Even going internally and saying, hey, can I get a license for this particular piece of software? Right, so one of the things that really gets lost when we talk about open source is that fundamentally it was more convenient to use. Anybody use the package management systems in Linux? Okay, so again, half the room. If you haven't used these, basically you can think about it's like an app store for your operating system. So literally anything you could possibly want, you can install via one command, and the operating system, the package management system rather, within that operating system will keep it updated for you. This is a fundamentally more convenient way to acquire, develop, and use software. So that's great, right? That's a sort of win for open source. It is, and certainly has been. It's one of the reasons that open source has been as successful as it has been historically. But one of the things that open source communities in particular have not adjusted to, have not adapted to as yet, is that just as they were more convenient than proprietary software, the cloud is a lot more convenient than open source software, typically. So in other words, if I have a choice between talking to an account rep and downloading Postgres, I'm going to choose Postgres. If I have a choice between downloading Postgres, finding compute, finding network, finding storage to back it, and then finding somebody to hot back up, maintain it over time, protect it, or I can go over to Amazon Web Services, and in 2 or 3 clicks I have something running in 90 seconds, that's a lot more convenient. So again, does this mean that it's a binary switch that, hey, the most convenient product is going to win every time? It's not. But if you look at the markets, if you look at how things have played out over the last 2 decades, convenience wins more often than it doesn't. So when we think about number 3, when we think about the third choice that we want to make, one of the things that we talk about, it's a flip comment that I make to developers all the time, which is choice is good, but then it's bad, right? Which seems, I don't understand, choice is good, right? Because none of us, particularly those of you in the room who have done any negotiation with vendors, nobody wants to lack choice, right? You never want to have one choice. You never want to have a single provider that you're beholden to, because they essentially will dictate terms to you because they know your BATNA sucks. So the way that I talk about this typically is that choice is something like a parabola. It's probably more correct to say it asymptotically flies out to the right hand of the x-axis. Basically, we can think about it, it's like a parabola. I don't want one choice, that's not good. 2 or 3 choices, in many cases, is great. 3 or 4 choices, okay. 5 or 6 choices, now I'm having problems. 7, 8, 9, 10, you can see where this is going. So the utility and the value of having choice decreases as I add choice to the mix. There's a great book on this called The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. Talks a lot about this. But again, when we talk open source, when we talk enterprises today, one of the things that most of us haven't sort of adapted to is the fact that there is so much more choice Open source has been a wonderful boon to this industry, but choice does not come without a cost attached to it. So consider this. I gave a talk to the Apache Software Foundation last year. So the Apache Software Foundation has done a remarkable job over the years of assembling an enormous library of open source software that is high quality. And the way that I've tried to value this, for reporters in particular who don't understand essentially what these foundations are about, what this aggregation or accumulation of software is about, is that if you took these assets and you gave them to an organization, 10, 20 years ago, pre-open source, that organization would be worth billions and billions and billions of dollars, because the value of this software is that high. So, when we think about the Apache Software Foundation, again, and this is, literally a tiny subset of everything that's sort of in their quote unquote big tent, that's an enormous amount of choice. That's an enormous amount of utility. Anything I could possibly want to do in here, I probably have 2 or 3 different ways to do it. Java application servers, there's a couple. Web servers, there's a couple. Databases, there's half a dozen, right? Anything I could possibly want to do is in here. So this is option A. But again, when from the standpoint of a customer, from the standpoint of those of you who run enterprises and run technology organizations today, think about the choice. Think about sort of where we are. When we think about sort of where we are from a choice standpoint, I can try to sift through, sort of that wealth of assets and figure out which ones are good and figure out which ones I want. Or I can essentially go to a place like the Amazon Web Services console. They've pretty much picked out a service per. They more or less integrate well together. And this is my alternative. And this is one of the reasons that I tell commercial open source organizations today all the time. They tend to regard their competitor as a proprietary incumbent, frequently, in some cases, an open source alternative. Their competitor is not another software product. Their competitor in almost every case today is a cloud, which we'll come back to. So number 4. This is a quote. Many of you have probably seen the movie Ronin. This is a quote that I think everybody in this room probably has thought about quite a bit over the years, which is, would you walk into a room that you can't walk out of? So what are we talking about? Of course we're talking about lock-in. Of course we're talking about sort of the threat of being sort of locked into a particular provider. And the interesting thing for me is that having had conversations with enterprises about this over the past 20 years, one of the things that happens every time is that organizations don't want to be locked in, and yet they do it all the time. Right? So I have a conversation very regularly that goes something like, I got locked into Windows, I got locked into VMware, I didn't like it, that's not happening again. Okay, who's your cloud provider? Amazon. Okay, what services are you using? Kinesis, Redshift, Simple Queuing Service, Flexible Payment Service, and so on. All of which are great services, all of which are valuable services, all of which also are unique to Amazon. So here's the thing, is that as you think about lock-in, it's not for me or for anybody else for that matter to tell you that you can't or shouldn't be locked in. But it is important to do 3 things. It is important, 1, to be aware of when you're being locked in. Because most of the open source, or most of the cloud platforms rather, have provided conveniently very standard open source entry points. So you can come in and use Linux, you can come in and use MySQL or Postgres or all these sort of other, sort of vanilla open source flavors. But then, hey, there's these other things, these other adjacent services which are pretty great, and yeah, you might want to sort of extend into them. And all of a sudden, you wake up one day, wait, how did I get locked in? What does this mean? So you need to be aware of it. Every time that you're making a decision in terms of what you use, open source versus a proprietary alternative, be aware. Be aware of those trade-offs. Number 2, as you think about sort of the possibility of being locked in, many companies will say, you know what, where we are right now, this makes sense. I talk to startups who say this all the time. Sure, I don't want to be locked in. This doesn't necessarily make sense longer term, but this makes sense for me right now. Totally fine. But in other words, you have to sort of understand going in that your calculus, as far as what is an acceptable amount of essentially lock-in to accept from a particular vendor, is likely to change over time. So what makes sense up front might not make sense next year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now. And in many cases, you do what you have to do. We all do. because sometimes we just have to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. But again, you need to understand that and consciously make that trade-off, and consciously understand, essentially the level of debt that goes into this. And then the third thing is that, as you sort of think about sort of open source as a mitigating factor against lock-in, which it absolutely can be, and in a perfect world, that's exactly what it serves as, you have to understand that vendors understand that very, very well. Vendors understand, essentially the calculus that they have to make, right? Which is, Shapiro and Varian said years ago that the net present value of a software company is exactly equal to the switching cost moving forward. So, given that, what is your commercial incentive as a supplier, even if you're a commercial supplier of open source software? Well, I'm going to do everything in my power to increase your switching costs over time, because guess what? That's what feeds my valuation. That's what feeds, sort of my business moving forward. So, again, when you think about lock-in, it's never as simple as don't get locked in or lock-in is fine. It is a complicated set of calculations and a complicated set of decisions that you need to think through, but importantly, you need to be conscious of when you do that. And then lastly, number 5, this is a question that we get all the time. Is the cloud good or bad for open source software? And the answer is kind of a bit of both, right? There isn't a clean answer here. Because on the one hand, the cloud is the reason that we have so many different pieces of open source software. The efforts of providers to scale their cloud and then release that software as open source is the reason that we have many of the projects that we enjoy today. And from a commercial open source organization standpoint, the cloud is an enormous boon, because many of these organizations are looking at it, they're seeing the same software paradox that I spoke about earlier and saying, hey, it's getting harder and harder and harder for me to charge for software the way that I used to, but I can charge as a service, backed by some of these public clouds, and that actually makes sense. So in many cases, the cloud is actually empowering and enabling the continual generation, the continual authoring of new open source software, whether it comes from big guys or small open source startups at the bottom. All of that is good. On the flip side, we have the not surprising, fact, as we just discussed, that the incentives here, from a provider standpoint, are complicated at best, right? It's not malicious, at least in most cases. It's a fact that organizations, have, the obligation to essentially perpetuate themselves, generate cash, to keep themselves, sort of as a viable going concern. And one of the issues that they have doing that is that their incentives as far as open source software can become skewed, right? So what starts as a vanilla implementation of an open source software package can morph into something quite different. And even if you preserve this, sort of open source vanilla implementation, and hey, that's what I come in as a customer and use, then by the way, I'm going to try to sell you this thing that you can only get from me, sort of right next door. So again, I'd love to say, hey, it's a clean, good or bad, in terms of, sort of the cloud's impact on open source software. But the net is that for everybody in the room, whether you're a consumer of open source software, somebody who leverages open source software, or some combination of both, the fact is that, the cloud in combination with open source software is going to change profoundly the way that your organizations do business moving forward. And with that, I'm just about out of time. Thanks so much.